One of the great spiritual impulses is that by returning to a more and more archaic form of wisdom, we arrive at more and more pure forms of that very wisdom. Truth was a primordial revelation for which we now only glimpse it dimly, if at all. Thus, scholars, seekers, archaeologists are all driven by a powerful impulse to delve deeper and deeper into the past in search of these most ancient inscriptions, the most ancient manuscripts, and expressions of that primordial and thus pure truth. This impulse toward the primordial truth has never been more strongly felt than in the early modern period and during the Renaissance, where scholars sought out sages like Hermes Trismegistus for their wisdom to place philosophy and religion on a purer, truer footing, and esotericists like Ficino, Pico, Reuchlin, and Agrippa all sought a kind of magical reformation of religion and philosophy on that foundation. This impulse, driven also by the notion that Catholics, Protestants, and Jews shared in common a mystical, esoteric core to their religion, and reaching back to that core would in fact allow them a reconciliation of their faiths and a restoration of a faith most pure. For many esotericists and occultists of that period, that shared mystical core were the mystical teachings of the Kabbalah. But there was a small problem. The library of Kabbalistic wisdom was profoundly technical, composed in Hebrew, but also in the strange Aramaic of the Sefer Zohar or the Book of Radiance, and it was carefully guarded by communities who had faced centuries of genocidal Christian violence. But the last quarter of the 17th century would see the greatest attempt of making Kabbalistic wisdom accessible to the wider world with the publication of Christian Noor van Rosenroth's monumental Kabbalah Denudata, the Kabbalah Unveiled. However, those tracts were puzzling in the extreme, and anyone hoping to make sense of them would need something of an introduction, a primer to Kabbalah. And that Kabbalistic primer would ultimately be composed by the esoteric philosopher Franciscus Mercurius van Helmont, and it was appended to the second volume of the Kabbalah Denudata. In fact, it remains one of the best introductions to the Christian Kabbalah, and it would eventually serve as the foundation for what would eventually become the Hermetic or Occult Kabbalah of later schools of esotericism. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support this kind of work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content like this on YouTube, then I hope you consider checking out my Patreon or some of the cool merch that we have on the channel. If you're new to the study of esotericism and you want to get the lay of the land and accessible and reliable texts, make sure to check out my study guide. And if you're interested in actual historical books, real historical books on the occult and the mystical, you can check out my Esoterica Rare Bookshop. You can find all those links in the description and in the pinned comment below. But let's turn now to a largely forgotten but profoundly important introduction to the occult world of the Kabbalah. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. As early as the 15th century, Christian esotericists, starting with people like Pico della Mirandola, came to the conclusion that the school of Jewish mysticism known as the Kabbalah contained crucial secrets necessary for the reformation of both Christianity and philosophy. At first, compelling converted Jews, the first translations of Kabbalistic texts were produced, including not a few forgeries to be honest, and slowly Kabbalistic ideas were introduced into the emerging underground of the occult philosophers, becoming one of the backbones of modern Western esotericism. To this day, Kabbalistic concepts, imagery, and spirituality remain core elements of the occult in the form of the Hermetic Qabalah. Thus, scholars recognize three distinct forms of Kabbalah. Kabbalah with a K, representing traditional Jewish mysticism. Kabbalah with a C, representing Renaissance and early modern syntheses with Christianity. And finally, Kabbalah with a Q, representing the contemporary uptake of those traditions into modern occultism. But to understand that tradition from the Christian Kabbalah, which largely sought to appropriate Jewish Kabbalah to Catholic Christian theology in the interest of both reforming Christianity, but also, of course, of converting Jews, to a system of mysticism largely completely detached from Christianity and Judaism, for that matter, into a contemporary occult practice, we must first appreciate Franciscus Mercurius van Helmont's 1684 Adumbratio Kabbalae Christianae, or the sketch of Christian Kabbalah, as a transitional phase in that process. Following the rise and success of the Protestant Reformation and the horrors of the religious wars that followed, the desire to produce a universal Christianity, a universal philosophy, and a universal science which would quell social strife and faction was simply on the minds of a wide range of intellectuals, philosophers, mystics, theologians, and scientists. But the search for the ancient pure theology, or Prisca Theologia, had been dealt a devastating blow in the early 17th century. Once heralded as the teacher of none less than Moses, the wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus, as preserved in the Corpus Hermeticum, was shown by Isaac Casaubon in 1614 to have been the production of the first few centuries after Christ, and just not the primeval wisdom once thought it was. Yet, esotericists held out hope, a hope that many placed in the preserved wisdom of the Kabbalah, said to have been hidden revelation accompanying the open, exoteric revelation of the Torah to the children of Israel. And with more and more text of Kabbalah being translated and printed, many Christian esotericists had what they took to be theological confirmation of the truth of the Kabbalah, and therefore of an ancient primeval truth upon which they could build this universal religion and philosophy. Specifically, the teachings of the Sefer Zohar, or the Book of Radiance, in the Kabbalah as it was expressed by Itzhak Luria, seemed to contain theological elements which were shockingly aligned with Christian theology. The Trinitarian understanding of the divine emanations, or the Sefirot, the importance of the Holy Spirit, or of the divine feminine element in the Shekhinah, the concept of the divine Son, the use of gematria, or mystical numerology and hermeneutics, the overall plan of salvation, key concepts of exile and messianic redemption. All of these seem to Christian mystics like von Helmont to represent a more primordial and thus purely true version of religion, specifically, of course, of Christianity. But, as we're going to see, von Helmont is going to go much further than previous occultists. While superficially arguing that he was developing his Kabbalistic ideas in the service of converting Jews to a purified, mystically imbued form of Christianity, he was actually accommodating Christianity to Lurianic Kabbalah, and thus setting the stage for a purely occult form of Kabbalah, one having achieved escape velocity from both Judaism and Christianity. But to appreciate what he's doing, it's worth briefly, and I mean painfully briefly, summarizing the core elements of the Lurianic Kabbalistic myth. The infinite light of Ein Sof contracted of that light into a near empty void known as the Tehiru in the process of Tzimtzum, or contraction. Divine light flowed into that void, shaping Adam Kadmon, the primordial spiritual human. And from the eyes, nose, and mouth of Adam Kadmon flowed further light, which formed in vessels to capture subsequent divine light. But those vessels were too weak to hold the divine light, and the top three cracked, and the lower seven shattered and fell into the void of the Tehiru. That shvira, or shattering, allowed evil to come into the world, forged in the fires of Mount Din. are the Sephira of Gevura, such as the task of the Kabbalist is to metaphysically repair the world through the process of tikkun olam, through scrupulously following the Torah along with more esoteric reparations as laid out by the Arizal. Now, that's only the most simplistic, generic telling of this myth. It's the equivalent of the planetary model of the atom that we teach to middle schoolers, a map very much pretending to be the territory. But the core concepts, the core parts of this myth are the concept of contraction, or tzimtzum, the shattering, shvira, and the reparation process of tikkun, especially by the shared actions of Adam Kadmon, the macro atom, and Adam Rishon, the microscopic atom, along with the Messiah as a kind of metaphysical bridge. Now, Franciscus Mercurius van Helmont was himself an extraordinary person in the history of esotericism, sadly now overshadowed by his father, the alchemist Jan Baptist, who actually coined the modern term gas. Yeah, gas as in like the noble gases. He got that actually from the Greek word chaos. In fact, he discovered carbon dioxide, which he actually called Sylvester gas. So a pretty important guy in the history of alchemy chemistry. And I mean overshadowed as in he is literally behind his father's portrait in the collected works of the elder van Helmont. But Franciscus Mercurius was a strange polymath. I guess we should be getting used to those around here. Strange polymaths are our type here at Esoterica. He was arrested and tortured by the Inquisition for 18 months. He spent his time in between said being tortured to compose a book on Hebrew as the truly universal language, specifically a language he could teach to hearing impaired people because it was natural to the structure of the mouth and the throat. An interesting choice considering, by the way, that he was arrested on charges of Judaizing by the Inquisition. So he was friendly with John Locke. He helped pioneer a communication technique for the hearing impaired, as I mentioned. He acted as a diplomat and a doctor. He worked closely with Leibniz, one of the co-founders of modern computation and calculus. He co-wrote Mystical Philosophy with Lady Anne Conway, who I've done a whole episode on. She's amazing. In fact, Leibniz actually ghost wrote his final work, and he composed his epitaph, which read in part, "If he had lived among the Greeks, he would now be counted among the stars." No small praise from a philosopher like Leibniz. But at his core, he was a committed Kabbalist, especially taken with the teachings of Rabbi Itzhak Luria, or the Ari, or the Arizal, and working with Christian Noor van Rosenroth, whose massive 2-volume Kabbalah Denudata was and remains one of the most impressive publications of Kabbalistic material from original sources into translation. He sought to provide an introduction or a lay of the land for someone working through this mammoth text of Kabbalistic sources. And to be sure, this would have been a very much welcome addition by the reader, considering that many of the texts gathered and translated in the Kabbalah Denudata were among the most difficult in the Sefer Zohar, but also some of the most later difficult technical texts by other Kabbalists. Those would include Kabbalistic luminaries like Gikatia, Cordovero, Naphtali Bacharach, Chaim Vital, and the philosopher-mystic Abraham Cohen de Herrera, an important influence on Spinoza, no less. That introduction as a primer would be attached to the second volume of Kabbalah Denudata as an appendix, and it was called Adumbratio Kabbalae Christianae, or a sketch of Christian Kabbalah. This anonymous tract of only about 70 pages originally is a staged conversation between a Christian philosopher and a Kabbalist, in which the Christian reveals to the Kabbalist that the tenets of Kabbalah are both truths revealed but also culminated in Christianity, if it's properly understood, of course. Further, it's made clear that the tract is written in the hopes that by revealing the truth of Christianity, Kabbalistic wisdom would basically show that Judaism is both redundant and unfulfilled, and thus Jews would want to convert to this version of Christianity. Now, none of that is new in the least. Since the times of Pico, Christians had studied and appropriated. Pico literally calls what he's doing miraculous appropriation, and they have deployed Kabbalah to both reform Christianity, but of course also in the hopes of converting Jewish people. using the weapons of the Jews against them, as this old motif goes. Now, this is something that Dan Atrell, the modern Hermeticist, and I have explored at length in conversations. And if you really want to get into those for a real deep dive on, frankly, the rather dark origins of perennialism, you should check out our conversation in the link below. But that conversionist prerogative is, at least in this case, much more apparent than real, as I suspect, and as I hope to show you. But recall that Van Helmont had already been arrested and tortured by the Inquisition for the heresy of Judaizing, so he probably wasn't going to risk that one again, hence it being both anonymous and really for converting, literally he says, capturing the Jews at the very beginning of the tract. But that cover story of wanting to convert the Jews pretty quickly begins to fall away as you read the text. The first alert that something strange is going on, and that's saying something at this point, is that when the Christian philosopher quotes from the New Testament, he doesn't do so using the Latin Vulgate or even some more ancient Greek version of the text, but the Syriac translation in square Hebrew script for printing. Of course, Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, but it's also a translation from Greek. It's not originally written in Aramaic. But what's going on here should be relatively straightforward. Van Helmont is eschewing both the Latin and the Greek, long associated with the official church, for the Syriac Aramaic, which is closer to the original language spoken by the primitive church, including Jesus himself, though Jesus spoke a Galilean dialect of Aramaic. But by using a Semitic language, even if it is a translation from Greek, the text is aiming at something more ancient and thus more true, perhaps, in its Christian teachings, even again if the Syriac Aramaic is kind of more vibes than scholarly substance. Secondly, and more importantly, the text overwhelmingly has the Christian philosophers seeking to find in Christian scriptures, philosophy, and church fathers sentiments which actually agree with the doctrines of the Lurianic Kabbalah, seemingly not in the interest of conversion, but because those Lurianic doctrines are just true. Now, of course, near the end of the text, Jesus is going to be revealed as the true Messiah. The Jews are all ultimately going to have to convert, etc., standard fair stuff. But it's almost an afterthought in the text. An afterthought, especially considering that the three Kabbalistic doctrines which the Christian philosopher seeks to prove to be true to the Kabbalist, but really to the audience, are the doctrine of contraction, the introduction of evil into the primordial world of the breaking of the vessels, in the process of universal salvation through Gilgul or reincarnation, along with the final messianic redemption in the process of tikkun or reparation. Now, let that sink in for just a second. The task of the book is to prove that Christianity proves the truths of these Lurianic doctrines: divine contraction as opposed to creation from nothing, the origin of evil as the shattering of the vessels and not that whole debacle in the Garden of Eden, universal salvation via reincarnation and not limited salvation, indefinitely no reincarnation in the official church, and finally messianic redemption via Jesus Christ as Messiah, sure, but through a process of tikkun as theurgy via Adam Rishon and Adam Kadmon. It's just breathtaking when you realize what's happening here. This book isn't really for converting Jews to Christianity. It's for converting Christians to Lurianic Kabbalah. So how in the world does Van Helmont attempt to pull this off? He does so by dividing the discussion into 4 topical sections defined by distinct metaphysical moments in the Lurianic myth cycle, what they call the primordial institution, the phase of creation via contraction or Tzimtzum and all the initial emanations, the state of destitution, the phase of the metaphysical fall via the shattering of the vessels, what von Helmont calls the modern constitution. This is the process of redemption, especially the defense of the notion of Gilgul or reincarnation. And finally, the supreme restitution, or the threefold process of the messianic redemption. Let's take a look at these in turn somewhat briefly. You should read this text for yourself, honestly. But what he's attempting to do here is create something much more of a Christian Lurianism than any kind of accommodation of Kabbalah to Christianity. First, the primordial institution is concerned with the process of creation through contraction, or Tzimtzum, as opposed to the more orthodox version of creation from nothing. Though von Helmont could be squirrely here a little bit, and just note that for the Kabbalists, it is literally the divine no-thingness, Ein Sof, from which all somethingness emerges, so he could kind of get away with it, at least in a literal sense. But in these early chapters, he's actually pretty slow to introduce thoroughly Kabbalistic language. He prefers the most glorious God, a nod to the Sphira of Keter as divine Kavod, as opposed to the language of Ein Sof. But the underlying process undoubtedly is that of contraction, or Tzimtzum. And we're also kind of lured into his methodology by which he demonstrates that Kabbalistic ideas are present in the New Testament and in the Church Fathers, such that, allegedly, Jews will feel comfortable converting to his version of Christianity. Of course, von Helmont's agenda is, as I suspect, and as I pointed out a moment ago, quite the inverse. He's making Christians at home in Lurianism, further allowing the Kabbalists to insist that they use terms more symbolically than literally. This will also allow von Helmont to slide between both Christian and Jewish linguistic registers, equivocating as necessary to combine similar terms and concepts which are actually profoundly different between the two faith traditions. Now, this is a very clever trick, this moving between terms which are similar superficially but quite different under the hood. It's a trick I think is clever, but probably not one that actually would have tricked a systematic theologian or a real deep Kabbalist. Probably also wouldn't have tricked the Inquisition. Tzimtzum accomplished, he details the various entities that emerge from the primordial contraction. First, the primeval human, or Adam Kadmon, which he identifies with the eternal Christ, the Sphirot and their configurations as countenances, or Patsufim, which he identifies with the Trinity, at least the top of those, the famed four worlds, the five souls, the messianic soul, the combined soul of all of humanity, which he terms the protoplasmic Adam, and the angels and demons, along with the substance or substrate that will ultimately become the physical cosmos as we know it. Again, all of this is to be contrasted with the standard account of creation from the universe from nothing, typical with Orthodox Christianity. Here we have a system of emanations from contraction. With the major structural components emanated, he briefly describes the cosmic tragedy of the breaking of the vessels in what he calls the state of destitution. Here the divine light cracks the upper three vessels meant to hold them, and it shatters the lower seven. Those shards are transformed into the demonic klipot, which now must be redeemed through the theology of Kabbalistic tikkun, or reparation. The modern constitution is kind of the here and now of the system. The finite souls of human beings have come to dwell in bodies capable of both righteousness and evil, both of which act to further entrench the demonic shards or redeem them back up into the divine harmony and oneness. The process of tikkun, or reparation, is accomplished by the shared work of Adam Rishon, who elevates the shards through the following of the mitzvot, that is to say, us, and Adam Kadmon, who separates the shards out and restores them, almost like putting things back as a shattered vessel. However, the process cannot be accomplished fully given two separate conditions. The first is that a human being generates sins through their lifetime that they themselves fail to redeem. Thus, every soul is regenerated, cycle after cycle, Gilgul, into new bodies to do further mitzvot, but also to redeem those sins of their past lives in that process of Gilgul Hanashemot, the rolling of the souls. Now, Van Helmont realizes that this is probably the thorniest concept from Lurianic Kabbalah he's going to have to deal with in terms of defending it to Orthodox Christians. But defend he does, though primarily not with reference to the scriptures, especially the New Testament, but with references to philosophical proofs and a little bit of references to the Church Fathers, by which he submits a great many, making this the lengthiest part of the tract without any doubt. And it's one of the most sustained defenses that I know of reincarnation or transmigration of souls from the early modern Christian literature, along with a lot of other texts actually that von Helmont penned during this period. And this no doubt had a profound influence on the development of similar notions in later forms of things like theosophical Christianity. But a final problem also lurks here for von Helmont, the bridge that connects Adam Rishon to Adam Kadmon. And of course, that theological bridge is none other than the Messiah. The final section, the Supreme Restitution, deals with the threefold process by which the Messiah serves as the linchpin of the process of universal redemption. Yeah, no one goes to hell in this system. Reincarnation goes on, simply on and on, until redemption is accomplished for every soul. The first phase of this process is that by which the Holy Spirit, or the Shekhinah, will lead an assault on the forces of evil, sort of destabilizing or disabling them. The second phase is the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Christ as Jesus, allowing Adam Rishon, remember that's us, to fully realize their redemptive works in this plan of salvation through faith and good deeds, or mitzvot. This will culminate in the purification of religion, including, of course, the ultimate conversion of the Jews, but also the destruction of Roman pagan Christianity prior to the end of the metaphysical exile. The final culmination of all of this is that the greatest demonic shard, or klippah, Satan, or as the text has it, Adam Belial, will be cast into the great darkness, and the final light will be united with divinity, and the Messiah will rule with the Divine Father for the eternal seventh millennium. And with a final encouragement to align oneself with the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, the texts come to a dramatic, if not a bit of a sudden staccato ending. In a tour de force of only about 70 pages, von Helmont has effectively created a rather subversive theology, one in which some of the most basic elements of Orthodox Christianity are undermined before clearly Kabbalistic elements are sort of smuggled in, hacked in almost. What's most interesting to me about this document, though, is, as I mentioned earlier, that this isn't really an attempt to force Kabbalah, Jewish Kabbalah, into a Christian form, but the other way around. And in this way, it's a crucial step in the process by which Kabbalah, as a spiritual meme, would achieve escape velocity from both its traditional Jewish roots, but also the shackles of Orthodox Christianity and this desire to convert the Jews. And as such, it paves the way for the development of what would become the occult and Hermetic Qabalah of modern and contemporary esoteric spirituality. Recall that this very text, Cabala Denudata, though not this specific text of von Helmont, unfortunately, would go on to be translated by MacGregor Mathers, co-founder of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in 1887, as the Kabbalah Unveiled, one of the texts of Kabbalah at the center of the contemporary occult renaissance. It's still in print, and it's still as unreliable a translation as you can get, unfortunately. But you might be wondering still, a lot of what von Helmont and previous Kabbalists discovered in Kabbalistic texts like the Sefer Zohar, it does seem to map onto Christian theological concepts rather elegantly. And you'd be right to think that, but not probably because there's some shared mystical core or perennial philosophy at work between the two traditions, or at least that's not totally the reason. As has been shown by scholars of the Zohar like Yehuda Liebes, the composers of the Sefer Zohar self-consciously imported some elements of Christianity, especially the Trinitarian nature of the first three Sephirot, specific elements of the messianism, the Shekhinah as the feminine element of God akin to both Mary and the Holy Spirit, along with several other distinct concepts into the theology or theosophy of the Zohar in its composition in the late 13th century. Now, this was done, at least in part, to compete against the mass conversions that were following the Maimonidean controversy, a kind of anything the Christians can do, we can do better strategy to prevent the hemorrhaging of conversion. But in a somewhat hilarious turn of events, Christians now 2 centuries later would discover these seemingly Christian elements in texts like the Zohar, and believing that they were divine secrets revealed to Moses, secretly passed down to Shimon Bar Yochai in his circle, and then revealed to the world in the Sefer Zohar in the 13th century, took them as evidence for the primeval truth of Christianity. Thus, the circles of those that composed the Sefer Zohar had the strange fate of infusing Christian elements into a text, which were later discovered by Christians, then taken to be revelation in the Kabbalah, only to be then prioritized over and against Orthodox Christianity by people like von Helmont, before finally becoming a wholly independent spiritual dimension of contemporary esoteric spirituality. I mean, that's a wild ride, folks. It's like a comedy of errors, but in esotericism, a comedy of esotericism. Sheila Spector has produced a wonderful introduction and translation of von Helmont's Adumbratio Kabbalae Christianae, which actually features a facing page edition of the original 1684. It's published by Brill, so you're gonna shill out some money for that. Also, I'll say that the work of Alison Couder is actually crucially important to this time period in von Helmont, although her work is often difficult to access at times, and it's often just as expensive, unfortunately. But a lot more to come on the history of the Kabbalah. Until then, thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.